Hello, I'm Greg Murray. I wanted to speak to you about Scottish independence today. I wanted to talk to you partly because I think on very important subjects it's quite important to hear the voice and, if you like, look in the eyes and feel who is telling you this. Also because the amount I want to say would take a huge amount of time to type. And because a number of people connected to my blog have been nagging me that I should do more podcasting or video casting, because that apparently reaches a wider audience than writing. I will try to write up the bones of this anyway. And finally, I would say, this is just me using the camera on my laptop at home, so you will hear children and family members moving around, and I won't well get interrupted by cats and things. So don't expect a wonderful studio quality experience. But what I do hope is that the quality of my thought and ideas, and perhaps the newness of some of the information even, will give you cause to think seriously about what I'm going to say to you, and I'll try to make this available both as a video cast and as an audio podcast. Well, let me start. There's a lot of despondency about at the moment among supporters of Scottish independence who find it difficult to see the clear path that's going to get us there in the next year or two. And there are very many of us who've been trying to get there in the next year or two for the last 10 years. It does appear that the leadership of the Scottish National Party had rather abandoned independence, had accepted that London have a veto, and that if London veto, there's nothing we can do about it. And the current SNP leadership campaign has empowered those within the SNP who are basically devolutionists to say so. We have actually seen Stuart MacDonald discussing the possibility of independence around 2050. We have seen Macpherson, the Leaf MSP, write an article saying that we shouldn't really be thinking of going for independence until we have a sustained 60% plus in the opinion polls for some time. And of course that would never happen, because without a campaign with an actual goal and prospect of immediate independence at the end of the campaign, you can't shift the polls. They haven't shifted in our favour at all since 2014 to any significant degree, and currently we're around the 46% we were at then. And we've had Humza Yousaf talk of independence as an aspiration, this rather vague, diaphanous thing we should strive towards. And there's been this campaign to denigrate the idea of actually getting independence. The idea of actually becoming independent is described as process. That's a meme that's been used all over social media. No, let's not talk about process. By process, they mean becoming independent. Let's not talk about becoming independent. Let's just talk about independence as an aspiration, something you talk to people about and vaguely hope will happen one day in some kind of mysterious way without any process involved. Which is plainly nonsense. This is just the entrenchment of devolutionism by people who've made good, well-paying careers out of devolutionism. Let's be upfront about that. So it's my view there are still many, many people, including the majority of members of the Scottish National Party, who actually really do want independence. How do we get there? Well, the first thing is by acknowledging that we have the right to independence. Scotland is a nation with the right of self-determination under the Charter of the United Nations. That used to be something that wasn't in any doubt. There could actually be no better proof of the fact than the fact we had a referendum in 2014 in which the United Kingdom recognised that we had the right of self-determination and was prepared to support Scottish independence had that referendum been won. Now, you can't lose the right of self-determination. It's in the UN Charter. It's an inalienable right. It's in the category of inalienable rights in international law. But there are other international inalienable rights. For example, a nation's control of its mineral resources are an inalienable right, which means that even if the nation contracts away its mineral rights, it can at any time take them back within international law. Nobody can ever remove the mineral rights from a nation. And the right to self-determination is an inalienable right. That was expected for a great many years. Even prior to the 2014 referendum, we had Margaret Thatcher, for example, stating that a majority of SNP members of Parliament being elected would be sufficient for Scotland to be granted independence. The fact that in one way or another the achievement of a majority for independence would give Scotland the right to independence has been a settled fact in British politics forever, really, certainly for at least the last 100 years. And that, of course, follows the example of Ireland, which was similarly a member of the Union, the metropolitan union state of the British Empire, and which left and became independent, or at least part of it left, and the rest of it will rejoin Ireland in the next few years. And having said that there's never been, until recently, a dispute that the Scots are a people with the right of self-determination, there are other factors that make it plain that the Scots are a people. The fact that Scotland was a nation-state. It was actually one of the very earliest nation-states in Europe. There are various dates you could take between 900 and 1100 for the founding of the Scottish nation-state, depending in part on the amount of the current territory of Scotland you feel is necessary to be within that nation-state in order to qualify. But certainly by the 12th century, Scotland was very definitely a nation-state. And when you think that nation-states like Italy and Germany did not become nation-states until the middle of the 19th century, then Scotland is a very old nation-state indeed. And of course Scotland joined the Union by the Treaty of Union, a treaty between two nation-states. It didn't join by the Act of Union. The Acts of Union passed by the English and Scottish Parliaments. They were enabling acts to enable the treaty. The actual union was accomplished by the Treaty of Union, which is a different thing. And nation-states always have a right to resile from a treaty. You resile from a treaty and you deposit the fact you have resiled from the treaty with the depository at the United Nations in New York. And that's one of the practical steps which Scotland needs to take on the way to independence. But I'll come on to more of those practical steps in a moment. I also want to say a little bit more about establishing the fact that Scotland is a nation with the right to self-determination. Not only has it that history as an independent nation-state, it also, of course, entered into a political union and not a territorial union. Scotland always retained its own territory, with its own clear, distinctive border, and Scottish law always applied within the borders of Scotland. Throughout the Union, Scotland still retained its own legal system, which is fundamentally different to the English legal system. Scotland also, of course, maintained its own educational system, for example, has its own distinctive culture. So there is no room for doubt, I believe, that the Scots people have a right of self-determination, and that right is inalienable. Now that leads me on to the next important point I want to make, and this is absolutely fundamental, and I want you to listen to this and take it in. If you believe Scotland is a nation with the right of self-determination, you cannot also believe that Westminster has a veto over that right of self-determination. The two things are fundamentally logically incompatible. The right of self-determination under the UN Charter is an inalienable right. It can't be alienated to Westminster. Anybody who believes that Westminster has a right of veto over Scottish self-determination does not believe in Scottish self-determination. Plainly. They don't believe Scotland has a right of self-determination. They believe that Scotland has a right to veto it. It therefore follows, of course, that anybody who believes that Scotland must recognise a Westminster veto on independence does not believe in independence. By that, I particularly target Nicola Sturgeon and her followers. When she stood and said, Scottish independence must be achieved by legal means, by which she meant entirely by legal means in terms of the domestic law of the United Kingdom, she was acknowledging that the United Kingdom has a veto. If you believe that, you don't believe in the right of Scottish self-determination, and you don't believe in Scottish independence. If you go to the UK Supreme Court asking for permission to hold a referendum, you do not believe in Scottish independence. You're asking permission from London. You don't believe in independence. This is the blind alley, the intellectual, political and practical blind alley up which Nicola Sturgeon led the independence movement, and is the reason why there is so much despondency now. And it was completely and utterly unnecessary. It was totally unnecessary. The Scottish Parliament could have legislated to hold a referendum and held that referendum and left it to Unionists to try to go to court to stop it. It wasn't for the Scottish Parliament to stop itself deliberately from holding a referendum, knowing full well what the London Supreme Court would say, because the London Supreme Court will always uphold the sovereignty of the English Parliament. And here's the next very, very important point. The UK Supreme Court was quite right in terms of UK domestic law. In terms of the domestic law of the United Kingdom, the UK Parliament is supreme. It has passed the Scotland Act. It will enforce the provisions of the Scotland Act, and it can amend the Scotland Act and take away Scottish devolution rights at any moment it chooses to do so. That is the constitution of the United Kingdom. And there's no point trying to argue about that. The UK Supreme Court is absolutely right. In terms of domestic UK law, there is no route to Scottish independence. But so what? In terms of domestic Soviet law, there was no route to independence for Estonia, Slovenia. Sorry. I don't know how to edit this, so you'll have to keep the mistakes. In terms of Soviet domestic law, there was no route to independence for Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. In terms of Yugoslav domestic law, there was no route to independence for Slovenia or Croatia. The domestic law of a state is not the determining factor. The domestic law of the state is utterly irrelevant. And that's the next important fact I want you to remember. The domestic law of a state is utterly irrelevant. The fact that the UK legislation and the UK Supreme Court says that Scotland cannot become independent is utterly irrelevant. Becoming independent, and again, please, this absolutely key point, becoming independent is an expression of the existence of a state in relationship to other states. It's about, are you a state like France is a state and Germany is a state and America's a state and China's a state? And do they recognise you as a state, and can you interact with them as a state? What the domestic law in London says about it is nothing whatsoever to do with the case. Now, it's not just Craig Murray saying that. That is absolutely the firm opinion of the International Court of Justice, expressed in the Kosovo opinion, where the General Assembly of the United Nations asked the International Court of Justice whether Kosovo had the right to secede from Serbia without Serbia's permission and against Serbian law. And the International Court of Justice was unequivocal. It said that Serbia does have that right. It also said, another very, very important point, you often hear unionists say, oh yes, there's a right of self-determination, but it's counterbalanced by the right of territorial integrity of the state. The United Kingdom has the right of territorial integrity of the UK state. That is total nonsense. In the Kosovo judgment, the International Court of Justice specifically stated that the right of territorial integrity only applies in relation to other states. Meaning, it means that part of the United Kingdom cannot be annexed by France or Germany or China or Russia or the United States. Another state cannot come in and annex part of your territory. It doesn't mean that there cannot be secession to form an independent state from within your territory. And that was absolutely plain. There's no doubt that is the international law. That is absolutely plainly stated in the opinion of the International Court of Justice on Kosovo. And it's also worth remembering that the United Kingdom was one of the nations which gave its opinion, which intervened in the International Court of Justice hearing on Kosovo. And the United Kingdom argued very, very strongly that Kosovo had the right of secession. And the United Kingdom argued very, very strongly that the domestic legislation of a state cannot constrain a part of a state which wishes to secede. And the United Kingdom made the point very strongly that that could stop all secessions. The United Kingdom argued specifically in terms that it will almost always, almost as a matter of definition, be illegal for a part of a state to secede, but that cannot stop secession. That cannot overrule the right to self-determination. And the United Kingdom was absolutely right to argue that the domestic law of a state cannot overrule the right to secession and the right to self-determination. And the International Court of Justice was absolutely right to agree with the United Kingdom that that is the case. And that is, of course, the opposite of what the UK Supreme Court have said when it suits them. When it was their own case, of course, they said, no, UK domestic law can overrule the right of Scotland to self-determination. Act of completely appalling hypocrisy, but was always going to happen. Was always going to happen. And here is the next very, very important point I want you to remember. And that is that the United Kingdom will never let Scotland go voluntarily. Scotland is far too important to the UK establishment. Scotland is a very wealthy country, potentially. Scotland has massive resources. It has vast energy resources, both in terms of oil and gas and in terms of renewable potential. The renewable potential of Scotland is absolutely gigantic. Scotland also has a very large landmass. It has a very, very talented workforce. And it has very enormous seas, both in terms of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. Scotland is a major economic potential powerhouse and contributes. Of course, it also has a very flourishing higher education, has some very interesting high-tech industries, has an extremely important food and drink business, including, of course, whiskey, but also a lot of great high-end agricultural and fishing produce. The United Kingdom is never going to let Scotland go voluntarily. The UK establishment is all about control of resources, control of wealth, control of money. And the economic resources of Scotland are very, very important. And the UK establishment won't let them go. Maintaining the territorial integrity of the UK is the number one task of both the UK armed forces and the UK security services. They have an annual tasking exercise where they're given all sorts of lists of tasks. Right at the top is, of course, maintaining the territorial integrity of the UK, and that means keeping the UK together. That's what the British establishment is about. It's never going to agree. It only agreed in 2014 to a referendum because they believed there wasn't a chance at all that the referendum would be won by Scotland. At the time they agreed, opinion polls on independence were in the range of 28% to at most 32% in favour of independence. David Cameron agreed to the referendum because he believed that the Scottish independence movement would be humiliated. It would be defeated so comprehensively that would basically kill off independence for all of our lifetimes. That, of course, did not happen. The opposite happened. Once people actually could hear the arguments in favour of independence, the fact that it was a possibility actually became real in their minds, perhaps for the first time in the lives of many people, and in particular once hope of a better future was offered to those who have got the roughest deal in society. There was a massive outpouring of excitement and hope for the future and political discussion on the street and online. And despite massive hostility from the media, massive united hostility from the media and from the UK establishment, we managed to get up during the course of that campaign from 30% to 46%. That's an incredible shift in public opinion over a short period of time. And I have no doubt that given another campaign where again, people for once get equally to hear the arguments for independence, to get at least a reasonable shout at hearing them over the media and to hear them argued on the door and online, I have no doubt we will make a similar stride forward again. But the UK establishment also has no doubt of that. And that's why they are just never going to agree. It's not going to happen. They are never going to agree again. They had the fight of their lives in that last week when there was an opinion poll putting yes at over 50%. And if you remember, they pulled out all the stops and cheated like mad. They broke purdah, they got the Queen to intervene, they had the vow published by Gordon Brown and David Cameron and all political parties, promising massive devolution, none of which of course ever happened. They had Gordon Brown leading every news bulletin, charging up and down, making passionate speeches for days on end. And in the end, they managed to fend off independence. But it gave them a huge, huge shock. And they're not going to do it again. They just are never going to agree again. I've been saying this for the last 8 years, and I've been proven right again and again and again. There's just no way they will ever agree to a new independence referendum. There is no path forward to independence in agreement with Westminster. If Scotland wants independence, Scotland is going to have to take it ourselves. There's no cosy, tea-drinking, happy, nodding, smiling way forward with the UK establishment. They will do everything within their power, pull off every dirty path and trick in the book, use their security services, use their media, use everything they have at hand, use what economic weapons they have. They will do everything to try to stop us becoming independent. We have to take independence for ourselves. So, how do we do that? Well, and here's the next one of those key thoughts I want you to have. devolution is a trap. The way forward to independence is never through devolution. It's an absolute trap. And the trap works in two ways. And the first way is that it is an absolute delusion to believe that you can earn independence by showing how competent you are in government through the devolution process. Because you can never deliver good government through devolution. Under devolution, you are hamstrung. We've been hamstrung throughout the last decade by Tory austerity. And whoever's in charge in Holyrood has to implement Tory austerity. That's why our NHS is crumbling. That's why our local government services are so poor. That's why our education system is falling behind in international league tables. It's not actually the fault of the SNP at Holyrood. It's the fact they have to work within Tory spending constraints and always will do so. Now, you can try and mitigate it. You can try and make things a little bit better through devolution. And, I think there is an argument that the Scottish NHS is in a slightly better condition than the English NHS. You can make that argument, and maybe that's a little bit of an achievement. But the NHS is going to hell in a handcart because of lack of funding, and in Scotland it's not going to hell in the handcart quite so quickly, isn't really the strongest argument for independence, is it? There will always be muddles and mess-ups in government, especially when you're choked of funds and have no ability to direct the economy yourselves and no fiscal autonomy. There will always be mess-ups that the unionist media can slam you with. You'll never get the credit for anything good you do. You'll always be attacked for anything that goes wrong. Devolution is a trap. It sucks you into thinking you are making things a little bit better. If you weren't here, it would all be a bit worse. You are running it a bit better than the Tories would with very limited amounts of money. But actually, public services are going down, as they always will go down in the UK, whether it's under a blue Tory government or a red Tory government, with the Labour Party just as keen on public sector cuts and on privatisation as the Tories are. You can't make progress through devolution. That's one way devolution is a trap. You fool yourselves into thinking you're making things better, but all you do is open yourself up to massive criticism as you struggle with your hands tied behind your back by the Tories to try to run things. The second problem is, of course, the comfy slippers problem. Devolution provides lots of very highly paid jobs to the political class in Scotland, which makes them comfortable as part of the UK settlement. Because remember, devolution is part of the UK settlement. Devolution is unionist. Let me say this again and again. Devolution is unionist. And if your politicians, even those who started out for independence with some fire in the belly, can be diverted into devolution and become very handy, making £80,000 a year, plus loads of expenses, plus lots of assistants, plus ministerial cars, etc. They become very comfortable, big pensions. It's all very nice. And independence seems to them somehow much less urgent when we're doing so well, and when, of course, if a bid for independence failed, they may lose their jobs completely. So devolution is another trap in that it's a form of bribery. It's a way to bribe the Scottish political class. Devolution bribes the Scottish political class out of going for independence. So that's the devolution trap. How do we get to independence? Well, the answer is quite simple, in that to become independent, you declare independence. Now, the majority of countries in the world have become independent during my own lifetime. Let me say that again. The majority of countries in the world have become independent during my own lifetime. And very, very few of those became independent following a referendum. There's no requirement to have a referendum. Not only is there no requirement, it is absolutely not the norm to have a referendum. You don't have to have a referendum. In most cases, it's a resolution or declaration by the local parliament or assembly which brings about independence. That is the normal way. That is how it's been done in at least over 80% of the cases. So, the way you become independent is you elect a Scottish Parliament, which stands for election on the basis that we will declare independence. If we win the election, you win the election, and you declare independence. The Scottish Parliament passes a resolution dissolving from the Treaty of Union and declaring that Scotland is resuming its independence. It then files that resolution at the United Nations. You will say, but how do you enforce that? How do you make that stick? And you are absolutely right that is the key point. How do you enforce it? How is that different from what Catalonia did, and when, of course, the attempt led to horrific violence by the fascists of the Spanish Civil Guard? Well, that is actually your answer. What you need to ask yourselves is, why did Slovenia succeed when it did this? And why did Catalonia fail? And the answer to that is that there are a number of criteria by which other states judge whether or not to recognise an independent state. There are a number of criteria. Those include those ways of measuring whether you have the right of self-determination that I discussed in detail earlier. Those are important. But the most important criterion of all, and the criterion which actually up until around the Second World War was generally the only criterion states applied. It's softened now by things which are much more principled, but it's still the basic criterion, is, do you control the state, the territory, which you are claiming? If you're claiming to be a state, do you control the territory which you are claiming? And can you exercise the functions of a state within that territory? That is the basic test. And that is the test which Slovenia passed and which Catalonia failed. Catalonia declared independence but didn't have control of its territory. Its territory was overrun by the Spanish civil guard and military, and it didn't have control. Slovenia exerted control of its territory. Its declaration of independence resulted in a invasion by the Yugoslav Federal Army, but that invasion met with physical resistance. Now, it's important to say that the large majority of that physical resistance was not violent resistance. It was physical in terms of being prepared to come out in huge numbers and stop the passage of soldiers and tanks and be prepared to be shot at or imprisoned. But it wasn't, to a large degree, physical in terms of shooting back. There was some shooting back, and in fact, I believe 10 people, I think it was 10 people, died in the Slovene War of Independence. 10 people, of course, is 10 people too many. I certainly hope we can manage it without losing anyone. But you have to be prepared to put up that physical barrier. In the case of the Baltic states, it was the fact they could get out huge numbers of people on the streets, make human chains, demonstrate massive public resistance, that made it plain to the Soviet Union, if you like, that the game was up, and unless you were prepared to mow down huge numbers of people, then you are going to have to give in to independence. And Scotland has to take that route. What we have to do is declare independence and then take control of our own streets and be prepared to be killed by the British Army should that be the consequence. Because an independent state has the right of self-defence. I would be entirely against any act of violence towards Scotland becoming independent. But once you have declared independence, you are a state with the right of self-defence. And you have to indicate, it's one of the functions of a state, you have to indicate to the international community that you are prepared to exercise that right of self-defence, that you are prepared to control your own territory, in order for other states to take you seriously and to recognise you. And there are several concomitants to this. There are things we should be doing now to prepare for this. One of the most important of all is the judiciary. You have to be quite certain that once you have declared independence, the loyalty of the judiciary will be to Scotland, to the independent state of Scotland, and will not be to London. That the judiciary will accept they are now applying Scots law, not UK law, and will not be taking orders or paying attention to Westminster legislation. That, except where it's been adopted into Scottish law, that is extremely important, and we should be preparing for that now by making certain that any judicial appointments in the next year or two are hardline nationalists. We should have been doing this for years and years, frankly. The fact that the SNP has been in power in Scotland for 16 years and has not made certain that the people in key areas of the state are hardline Scottish nationalists is part of what makes me think they've never really been that serious about independence. The same with the police. You have to make sure the people in charge of the police are strong Scottish independence supporters. And immediately on declaring independence, you have to make sure that everybody in an important position, that's all your judges, all your policemen, the commanders of any military garrisons in the country, all the senior civil servants, especially the people who collect tax, of course, you should look to all these people to take an oath of loyalty to Scotland. That's another way you assert you are a state. Scotland does not have, here's my next important point, Scotland does not have a path to becoming a state which is laid down before it is a state. Scotland has to act by itself, become a state, and then seek recognition. We can't go to the International Court of Justice because the International Court of Justice only hears states. It's conceivable we could try to get a reference by the UN General Assembly to ask for an opinion from the International Court of Justice. But I can really see nothing that would prompt them to do that. I can't see. Kosovo, again, obtained de facto independence, leading to a request for recognition, leading to the reference to the International Court of Justice from the General Assembly. But it had to achieve de facto independence before any of that happened. We have to achieve de facto independence before we can get anywhere. We don't have, in our current status, which is not as an independent state, we do not have access to remedies in international law. That's also an important point. We can only do this by achieving independence, and we can only do it the hard way, by actually showing we are really serious and taking our independence. This is a long, hard road. I don't know how many years it will take to get to that stage. Pardon. But that's the way to go. Once you've done that, once you've declared independence, and once you have established that you're not going to allow the British Army to kill you all, then you apply to independence at the United Nations, as I've said, by depositing a request to the United Nations Security Council and a revocation of the Treaty of Union with the UN depository. At that stage, of course, you face the fact that the United Kingdom is a member of the United Nations Security Council and theoretically will have the right of veto. We now have to look at the international balance of power and the forces at play here. And the next most important fact is hardly anybody likes the United Kingdom. The European Union will be delighted if the United Kingdom breaks up. They'll be delighted, of course, most of all because of Brexit, because the breakup of the United Kingdom would send a strong signal to other states which may wish to leave the European Union, to say that if you leave the European Union, dreadful things will happen to you, and perhaps your state may even break up. It's the strongest possible deterrent to other states leaving the European Union if the United Kingdom breaks up as a consequence of leaving the European Union. And like all major institutions, the European Union has a strong kind of internal defence mechanism that makes it act in the interests of itself as an institution. And it would be very much in the interest of the European Union for the United Kingdom to break up as a deterrent to others leaving. But also, of course, due to the fact that Scotland would bring all those resources I spoke to at the beginning back into the European Union eventually, almost certainly. That would be part of the pitch an independent Scotland would make. I realise there are people in Scotland who don't wish to join the European Union, and certainly that's their right. I myself am slightly ambivalent about it. But in terms of getting international recognition, being an avowed candidate member to join the European Union would put Scotland in a very strong position, very, very strong motive for other European Union states to support Scotland. And of course, we would be bringing in, among other things, Scotland's very rich and extensive fisheries, which are particularly important, it should be remembered, to the Spanish fishing fleet. We would have to make distinctions between ourselves and Catalonia in order to nullify any possible Spanish opposition, but there's no real sign of serious Spanish opposition at the moment. And the fact that it's rather difficult to outline the existence of a truly independent Catalan nation state in the way that Scotland used to be a nation state, and the fact of Scotland's particular legal status with regard to the Treaty of Union. These are all distinctions which are important in diplomacy for saying, this is not a precedent for Catalonia, don't worry. I say that with sorrow for my Catalan friends. I certainly hope they achieve their independence, but there's no special reason. There's certainly a much stronger desire among European Union states to see Scotland independent and reintegrated into the European Union than there is a desire in Spain to stop that happening. Spain shares that common European Union interest in the European Union splitting up and Scotland bringing part of the UK's resources back into the European Union, including the very important maritime resources. So we have that basic goodwill from the European Union. That is extremely important. We would also have a great deal of goodwill and support from the developing world, what's known as the G77 in the United Nations. The UK is not popular. Its reputation as a former colonial power and, of course, former centre of the slave trade very much counts against it. I personally have very, very extensive experience in Africa. I know several African heads of state personally, and I have no doubt whatsoever of our ability to pick up support from the developing world, where, as I say, the United Kingdom is not popular, and it's even less popular now because, of course, not only have the Tories left the European Union, the Tories have slashed the aid budget, and all these developing nations have seen their aid from the United Kingdom slashed. which of course has consequences. As I say, the United Kingdom is not a popular state. So, in terms of the United States, I think it would be very difficult politically for a president of the United States to oppose Scottish independence. It would have a great deal of, if you like, romantic sympathy from the United States population, and of course self-determination has always been strongly supported by the United States. So I think we would have the support of the European Union. I think we would have the support of the United States. I don't doubt we would have support of Russia. In fact, the Sturgeon people and the Tories keep telling us that Russia is actively trying to break up the European Union and support Scottish independence. I don't think that's true. I don't think Russia's ever given it much thought, but I think Russia and its allies would be quite likely to support the break-up of the United Kingdom as well. I don't see a major diplomatic problem in the United Nations. And here we have an interesting question as to what pressure all that diplomatic support can put on the United Kingdom to agree and not to veto at the Security Council. And I think this is the point. It is understood, I think, that if we reach that stage where Scotland is declaring independence and Scotland is taking control of its own territory and the Scottish people are exerting their own will and we are achieving freedom as a nation again, firstly, it'd be a terrible look for the United Kingdom to try not to allow that right of self-determination to the Scottish people. That would undermine everything they claim to stand for, and everything they've argued in other cases, like the Kosovo case, for example. It'd be a very, very bad look. But also, given it is not clear that they would ultimately be able to win in a standoff, how would they ultimately take possession of Scotland again if the Scottish people were not allowing them to do so? Given that London must appreciate that once we get to that stage, there is the possibility of defeat. London has to look to the question of its role on the UN Security Council. And I should explain to you, that is terribly important to London. The British establishment view themselves, as part of a world superpower, even though they're not at all. They're a second or third rate military power nowadays, but and a fast declining economic power. But nonetheless, they like to see themselves still as a great superpower, and one of the very few things, apart from possession of nuclear weapons, one of the very few things that gives them that superpower status is their being, for historical reasons, and it's crazy and outdated, but for historical reasons, they are one of the five member states of the United Nations, one of the five permanent members of the United Nations Security Council with a permanent veto at the United Nations. They are desperate to hold on to that status. Now then, in a situation where the UK is really more or less the only state trying to stop Scottish independence, one of the things which Scotland and its allies will have up its sleeve is dangling the carrot of the UK being able to keep that permanent seat at the UN Security Council after Scotland has gone. And I can see a situation where the Americans and others say to them, look, you can either accept Scottish independence and we will allow England and Wales, and whether Northern Ireland will still be part of a deal at this stage is a different question, of course, because of Irish unification. But the Americans could essentially say, either you, and the Russians and others, either you accept Scotland becomes independent and we will allow England to be the successor state and to keep a seat on the Security Council, or we're going to reopen the whole question of the United Kingdom seat on the Security Council, because why is such a declined power a member of the Security Council when India isn't, and Germany isn't, and Brazil isn't, and there's no African permanent member. These are huge questions. The easiest thing, of course, for London is if it is acknowledged as the successor state to the United Kingdom in exactly the same way that Russia was acknowledged as the successor state to the Soviet Union. And Russia then just kept the seat on the UN Security Council, and everyone pretended nothing had happened. Now I can see a deal whereby the same thing happens again, and England keeps its seat on the Security Council, and everything's just smooth and everyone pretends nothing has happened, provided that England quietly acquiesces to allowing Scotland to go its own way following a Scottish Declaration of Independence, as opposed to, bluntly, a great deal of blood in the streets of Scotland. I can see that working out as a deal. I wanted to make another point on that, incidentally, which is one thing that people don't realise, is that in the Russian precedent, it's the only really good precedent we have, the concomitant of Russia becoming the successor state and keeping its seat on the UN Security Council was that Russia had to adopt the entire national debt of the Soviet Union. Ukraine and Belarus and Uzbekistan, etc., they don't have any of the old Soviet debt. That all went to Russia. Russia took all that on because Russia was the successor state, and Russia kept the seat on the UN Security Council and kept the nuclear weapons and etc. and treaty obligations. And if the UK wants to keep its seat on the UN Security Council, it seems to me that the same thing has to apply. That means that the UK has to accept the entire national debt because the UK is the successor state. And that's a very, very important point. It's a very important point indeed, which relates in many ways to the setting up of Scotland's own central bank and its ability to attract reserves and launch its own currency. But that rather digresses, because at the moment I'm settled on the process of independence, and we can get there. We can get there. There's no reason at all why Scotland should not be a normal, independent, Northern European nation state, just like Ireland, just like Denmark, just like Sweden, just like Norway, just like Latvia, just like Lithuania, just like Estonia, just like many others. We can be a state. We can be at least as successful as those states. We are going through a period of horrible economic decline as the United Kingdom politically disintegrates. And I think the fact that the UK has just been through a period where it's had so many prime ministers and chancellors in the last year that I genuinely can't tell you off the top of my head what the number is. The United Kingdom is plainly in the last stages of the disintegration of an imperial state. That means that Scotland can seize its moment. There's no chance that there's going to be the assertive, aggressive power in London that's going to be able to evoke a national unity to kill Scots and stop us unilaterally from becoming independent if a majority of Scots vote for it at an election. But we have to do it that way. We have to do it in a way which is legal in international law, but is illegal in UK domestic law. And that means, of course, that we are risking, but at some stage there may be violence, but at some stage people may be jailed, that the movement for Scotland to become independent may be prescribed, become illegal. All of that, of course, will only make Scottish independence more inevitable and happen quicker. But there is a clear route to it. The route is in international law, And the root lies in not accepting a London veto. If you want to accept a London veto, you'll never get independence. Confess you are a devolutionist, confess you are a unionist. If you believe independence may only be got with London's permission, please do stop pretending you believe in Scottish independence. But if you are actually committed to Scottish independence, if you really believe in it, and you don't believe London can veto it, and please campaign like crazy, campaign like mad, join us in whichever political party you're working through. Get these views across, get these views over, make plain London does not run Scotland out of right. London has no right in international law to the possession of Scotland. We are our own people. We are a people with the right of self-determination. We are as entitled to fight for our national freedom as our ancestors were. We can make it. We can achieve the political will. We can win an election based on declaring independence. And having done that, we can control our own country and look about for international recognition. Thank you very much for listening.